Weekly Transportation Seminar. And today we have with us Lynn Weigand, who's a project manager for the Bureau of Transportation Engineering and Development for the City of Portland's Office of Transportation. She's also a PhD student in our Urban Studies program. And she was supposed to be with us the first week in January, for those of you who may have remembered, and that was the week of the ice storm and was canceled, so she has agreed to come back. And we have her today speaking about the Foster Road Transportation and Streetscape plan. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you. And if you could just briefly tell us a little more about yourself in terms of how you ended up where you are.
Okay. Well, before I came here, back to Portland, I'm a Portland native, I worked for the League of California Cities in Sacramento, California for 8 years, working with local government officials, mostly in planning and community development. And at that point, I developed a really strong interest in urban design and urban form, and seeing how California was really starting to sprawl at that time and having a lot of congestion problems led me to pursue a master's degree in landscape architecture at the University of Washington. So I went from Oregon to California up to Washington, got my master's in landscape architecture, came back to Portland, and then at that time, Portland's transportation office had just instituted both a pedestrian transportation program and a bicycle transportation program. So I worked for the pedestrian program for about a year and a half. Then I went to a nonprofit called Livable Oregon that was working statewide to promote livability issues, smart growth, compact development, alternative transportation issues around the state, as well as manage the state's Main Street program, which is basically downtown revitalization. And then in '97, I left there and came back to the Office of Transportation, which over the years has reorganized. And so now we are incorporating all the modes of transportation into all of our projects. So basically now, instead of a separate pedestrian program, we're trying to incorporate pedestrian planning into all of our transportation planning projects. Same with transit, same with bicycles. So what we're trying to do is get an integrated multi- or pan-modal approach to transportation planning. And the section that I work in has been focusing mostly on transportation planning, although we have also managed several construction projects. But we tend to focus our efforts in what we call neighborhood main streets and town center areas. And I did bring a few of these other plans that we have produced over the years for you to look at after class, but among them the Alberta Streetscape plan, which I managed from '98 to 2000, the Capitol Highway plan that also goes through some of those little neighborhood business districts, Woodstock Boulevard plan, Barber Boulevard plan, and others. So also Hawthorne, which I don't have a copy of. So what we've really tried to do is work in areas that have a significant business or commercial component and significant existing right-of-way constraints, and try to balance all of the modes in our planning efforts so that we can support both the residential uses and the commercial uses on the street, and try to promote more walking, more bicycling, more transit use at the same time. In terms of the Foster project, I want to give you a little bit of background about how the project came about and go through our typical planning process, and then take you through basically what was our council presentation when we presented this plan for adoption by the City Council last year. Basically, what happened with this project is that the Bureau of Housing and Community Development in the city had a target area program where they funded communities for 5 years to identify some of the issues that they wanted to work on within their neighborhood, and funded a facilitator and other projects for them to accomplish those goals. And the Foster target area was one of those that had been funded and was staffed through Southeast Uplift, which, as you probably know, is one of the neighborhood coalitions. And they identified Foster Road as one of their primary interest areas, both in supporting and building up the business district, and also seeing what they could do to improve Foster Road for pedestrians, for bicyclists, for transit, as well as making it a little safer for people driving along the street and accessing those businesses. So Southeast Uplift staff approached the city and asked if we would be interested in applying for a grant from the State Transportation and Growth Management Program, which ultimately provided the funding for us to do the planning work and produce the plan. The project management role, which is what the city and what I took on in this project, were basically to manage the process, to manage and facilitate all of the community outreach and input, manage the development of the plan, to hire and manage the consultant, and then to report back to the funder. So what we do really is manage all of the facets of the plan. It requires a lot of knowledge of the specific areas that we're looking at, but in this case we hired both a transportation engineering firm and an urban design planning firm to do a lot of the actual project work. Typically, what we do in these projects is kind of a three-phase approach. We start off with inventory and analysis. We really want to get a good sense of what's already happening out there, and that's where we go collect a lot of data. Just like any other research project, you have to start out, you have to collect a lot of information about what's already known about your project or your project area. So we will collect a lot of information from traffic counts, how many cars are on the street, how fast are they going, where are they turning, and how many people are turning where. We talk to TriMet. We find out how many people get on and off each bus stop along the route. We do pedestrian counts. We'll do bicycle counts. We'll talk to the community through our community outreach project, talk to business owners and so forth, and find out how people get there, what they're doing, and how they're moving around the street. In addition, we'll also look at the underlying land use. We'll look at the zoning, look at current use, look at potential for change based on what the land is zoned for and what it might become in the future. So we collect all that information so we have a good picture of what's going on. And then we start our community outreach process. And that really involves trying to work with as many people in the neighborhood as we can to get involved in the project and tell us what their primary goals are, what they want to see done, and to help us evaluate the alternatives and eventually select the preferred alternative that goes into the plan. In terms of design development, once we have all this information and we have some general direction from the community, then we do what is called developing conceptual alternatives. We're not going to get right to the design yet, but we're going to talk about generally what do we want this to look like. And areas like Foster Road are really long corridors. This project area went from 50th all the way up to 90th. So there's got to be some way of breaking it up. And in this case, our concept alternatives were really basic. It's like, do we treat the whole street the same? Do we kind of break it up in segments? Do we focus on nodes or areas where there's more activity? And if so, where are those areas, those districts? So those are the kinds, that's the kind of level we're looking at in terms of a conceptual approach, just to try to figure out where we want to focus our attention and what the primary goals for each of those areas would be. Once we've developed those and we've worked with the community, both through our Citizen Advisory Committee, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and some community workshops, and we've picked a general direction, then we start working on the details. We take a step back and we say, okay, for this area, what are some of the tools that we can apply that will help us achieve the goals? And I'll just give you one example. I actually do have a design toolbox that I can pass around as well, and this talks about some of the things that are in our bag of tricks, so to speak, when we start looking at the details. For example, if identifying pedestrian crossings is a primary goal in the project, if we want to improve the crossings, what's in our toolbox? Well, there's crosswalks. There's basic painted crosswalks. There are curb extensions. There are median refuge islands. There are a lot of different ways to make it easier for people to cross the street, short of actually putting in a signal, which is usually where people go straight to. We need to cross the street, put in a signal so the cars will stop. So basically at this phase, we look at all the tools that are out there and start winnowing down the choice of tools so that we get to a package that makes sense for each of the areas along the street. And then from there, we start talking about specific details like the pavement finish, the trees, the street lighting, the other types of things that also will be part of the plan. And then at that point, we start going into final plan development, and that's where we actually document everything, all the way through the process. We start with what we learned in our existing conditions study, and that's actually in the pieces that are coming around in a separate document called the technical appendix, because most people aren't going to read all the traffic engineers' reports and so forth. So we kind of put that off to the side. It's basic data that's accessible, but the plan itself talks about generally what were the conditions, what were the goals, and then outlines the primary elements of the plan. And I've given each of you a handout that's got just a very quick summary of the plan elements that you can take a look at and also follow along once I go through the presentation. I mentioned earlier that we do a pretty significant community outreach process in addition to some workshops or open houses, whatever is most appropriate. We always involve a citizen advisory committee, which tries to equitably represent not just the neighborhood associations and the business associations, but also individual business and property owners, residents along the street or in the nearby neighborhoods. In this case, we also involved the schools because we had 2 school crossings within the area. We look at the advocacy groups such as the Willamette Pedestrian Coalition and the Bicycle Transportation Alliance. So what we want to do is get all the interests to the table up front and really give them good information so we can have a dialogue and we can talk about options and come up with the best solution for the street. So at this point, I think what I'll do is stop and see if people have questions so far on this part, and then I'll go into the plan. Yeah.
Remember to use the microphone.
Yeah, you have to push the thing and get the little red button on.
When you do a transportation streetscape plan, how much of it do you do in-house and what do you contract to consultants? Is it usually the same piece of it that the consultants do, or does it vary by project?
It varies by project. Right now, our office is in a mode where most of the design work and some of the traffic engineering work is typically done by a consultant. 5 years ago, that wasn't the case. We were doing a lot more of our own work in-house, at least in our section, because everybody in our section either has a degree in landscape architecture or planning. But in some of the other sections, if people are more coming at it more from the project management point of view, they may hire out more of the services. So it does vary by project, how much money we have, what our specific expertise needs are. But we do always involve one of our in-house traffic engineers, at least to review the consultant's work, if not to do their own analysis. Other questions at this point? Okay, what I'm going to do then is just take you through the presentation, and if there are burning questions, stop me. Otherwise, we'll have a discussion at the end. But as I said, this is basically the presentation that we gave to City Council, and the purpose of that is really to, at this point, what we do is take the plans to be adopted by resolution. So it's not quite the same as some of the other ways that City Council can adopt things by ordinance, but basically this says that they approve of the plan, they authorize us to go forward, look for money, and eventually construct the improvements. So the project area was Foster Road, and we started at 50th and went all the way up to 90th, which, as you may know, is the beginning of the Lentz Town Center area. They have their own planning process in the town center area, so we stopped just short of that, but we did work very closely with the staff at the Portland Development Commission to make sure that what we were looking at for the street would match up with what they're looking to do for their part of the street. And as I said, we start out by looking at the existing conditions of the street, and what's always helpful is to look at a little bit of the history. And in this case, we found out from doing some historic research that Foster Road had a link to the Oregon Trail at one point. It was a former streetcar line, and there were storefront commercial areas along the street that we could still see vestiges of in some of the old buildings there. Let's see. Is there an easier way to get this to jump to the... Okay. Space bar will work? Okay, cool. So looking at Foster Road today, and it hasn't changed a whole lot since we started the planning process 2 years ago. As you know, it's one of our few diagonal streets that cuts across the grid. It serves the neighborhoods in southeast Portland. And because it links diagonally, it makes a lot of sense for people that are traveling from the northwest to the southeast in terms of a major travel route. We also found that while most people think of Foster Road as pretty much auto-oriented businesses, that once you start walking the street at a finer grain, you find not only those larger scale businesses that people access by car, but you also do find a fair number of smaller and locally owned businesses along the street as well that serve the neighborhoods. The other interesting thing about Foster Road is there are growing ethnic communities represented in the businesses and the residents near and along the street, both the Russian community as well as a Hispanic community and Asian. So there's quite a mix in the types of businesses that we find there as well. And one of the challenges that poses for our community outreach is to have translation available, and all of our outreach materials that were mailed went out both in English and in Russian, for example, because of the Russian community there. We also, at our first workshop, had people available to translate both into Spanish and to Russian and Latvian. So while we didn't have a significant amount of those languages represented as a primary language at the workshops, just having it available and having those people go out one-on-one to some of the business owners, they were able to disseminate information and bring questions back to us. The other thing that you don't really notice on first glance about Foster Road is it really is a community-serving street. It links parks, neighborhood centers, the Mount Scott Community Center, the YMCA. There are 2 schools that are nearby the street, and other community services. Multnomah County has some offices very close, as well as nonprofits like United Cerebral Palsy. So it really does serve a number of community interests and some groups with special needs, especially when you're talking about children or people that need access for various abilities, and that also pose some good questions and challenges into our planning process. Now we get to the part that is pretty typical for our data collection. We look at what we've got, how much right-of-way, how wide the street is, and as most of you know, Foster's a pretty wide street in cases, over 100 feet. We look at both the travel lanes, the turning lanes, the width of the sidewalk, and other existing conditions. We also look at the transit line and the transit use along the street. And in this case, Foster serves the Line 14 bus, which is the Hawthorne line, and TriMet was in the process of going through what they call their streamlining process. And that's where they go through with a whole line and look for ways to make service better, make it a faster ride, more efficient, easier for people to get to the bus stops. So we worked very closely with TriMet on this to identify some of the improvements that we could fold into the plan. We also found in this case that there's a real variety of conditions in terms of the transit stops. As you can see here, there are some bus stops that are really not in good shape at all, just a little bus and hardly any place to wait, or a little bench, I mean. And then other places where they have come in and done the improvements. You've got a nice shelter, you've got adequate waiting space. That's the ideal for most of the stops, but obviously we don't have the money to get there with every single one of them. Surprisingly, we also found through our pedestrian counts that quite a few pedestrians use Foster, and when you're driving along at probably over the speed limit at 40 or 45 miles an hour, people don't realize how many pedestrians actually walk along and try to cross the street. But there were a significant number of them, and people crossing both in the marked crosswalks and attempting to cross in a lot of places where it really wasn't very safe for them. We also found that the condition of the pedestrian environment varied widely. There are places where the sidewalk width is more than adequate, where you've got interesting storefronts to look at, a smaller scale of buildings, display windows, and so forth. We also found places where the sidewalk was very, very narrow. As you can see, fences and blank walls, and a lot of wide driveways entering the parking lots. But we didn't find a whole lot of bicycle use on Foster, and mostly what we did find were bicyclists that were actually riding on the sidewalk, not in the street, and a few bike stops, bike racks, but the street doesn't seem to be too bike-friendly at this point. So as I mentioned, we really do try to work with the community. In this case, this planning process evolved from a community effort through the Foster Target Area Program, and in our planning process, we had 3 workshops that allowed people to come in and work in small groups and tell us what they thought about the various options, about the goals, and also when we got to the draft plan phase to give us comments and feedback about the plan. It's interesting when you try to do these kinds of workshops because all sorts of decisions go into it that you don't think about, like, well, when should we do it? If we do it at night, some people can't come, but if we do it in the day, a lot of people can't come then. And trying to find a time that works between all of the neighborhood association meetings and other activities in that particular neighborhood is always a challenge. But we really make an effort to look at all those variables and find a time that seems to work for the majority of people who might come. And in this case, our turnout was really good at all 3 events. I mentioned the Citizen Advisory Committee earlier. In this process, they met for about 14 months. They met once a month for about 3 hours and went through a lot of detailed information that we presented to them both at the meetings and things that we mailed to them beforehand. And this is really the first forum for debate. If there are decisions to be made, controversies or differences of opinion, we really like to run it through the Citizen Advisory Committee and kind of see where they are on it, see if they can get to something, to a decision through consensus. We really try not to just have the hand vote because that gets to a win-lose situation. We really try to work through an issue, get enough information, have them go back to their various constituent groups so that we come to a decision that really does work for everyone. In this case, our Citizen Advisory Committee established some project goals which were presented to the community, refined a little bit, and came back. But basically, we were looking at 5 things. We were trying to make the street more pleasant, more attractive, more comfortable to walk along. We were also trying to make the walking environment much safer. We were trying to provide a safe corridor for vehicle travel. And that's something that sometimes gets left behind, is people were so interested in the pedestrian or the bicycle or transit use that they forget that while maybe some of us would like to drive less, that people do need to use their cars, and we do have freight access issues. There are several very large users of trucks like Fred Meyer, Safeway that use Foster, Mount Scott Fuel, who has their big trucks with bark, dust, and mulch coming in and out. And as we know in this economic climate, it's really important to still support the businesses. So what we try to do is really look for a balance with all the modes. So vehicle travel does need to continue, albeit at a more reasonable speed and perhaps more controlled. We were also looking to improve transit service and transit access along the street and look at appropriate bicycle access. As I mentioned earlier, we went through a concept planning process. We looked at a lot of options and came up with a concept plan that looks something like this, and that should be on your handout. The concept plan really was looking at focusing on 3 areas or districts for the majority of the work. The heart of Foster is the area around the 60s, which has the most intense small business use. And then we had 2 other areas, one at 50th where Foster co-joins with 50th and Powell, which has some business activity, not quite as much, but people really felt that was the gateway to Foster. That's where people enter the street. It's where it begins. It really needs more prominence and more attention. And then finally, there's kind of a crossroads district up at 72nd, and that street goes to Mount Scott Community Center. It's a transit link, and it was I'm sorry, that was at 82nd. That's where you've got Fred Meyer, you've got Safeway, you've got Wells Fargo. 82nd is a major, actually still classified as a state highway. It's owned by ODOT, so you have to look at a lot of transportation crossing issues there that work also with the state highway planning. The green link is what's at 72nd, and if you're not familiar with the area, 72nd is on the north side, comes in with a parkway. There's a really nice green parkway that comes into it. And to the south is Mount Scott Park and Community Center. So the idea there was really to try to connect the green on both sides of the street and link those two a little bit better. So this concept plan really was the framework for the details, and what I wanted to do now was just walk through an example of one of the districts and then go through some of the details, because really, as we know, the devil's in the details in the planning, and that's really where we had to make some of the hard decisions about the use of the right-of-way. This shows the Heart of Foster district from 63rd to 67th, and the idea was that this would be the area of the most intense improvements. Not only would we intensify the number and the treatment of the pedestrian crossings, we would have the most street trees, additional pedestrian scale lighting, bike racks, and other amenities that would help make this area more conducive for people to walk and support and use the businesses along the street. This is an example of one of the corridors, in this case the western corridor, and the corridors were really the areas between the districts. They received less attention, not because we didn't think the whole street merited attention, but we have to also realize the availability of funds to actually build improvements, and the community recognized the need to really focus attention in certain areas, because the street, that's almost 40 blocks, we couldn't fund enough to make the whole street get the same level of improvements. And also, when you have a variety, when things get more intense and more spread out, it actually creates differentiation, and that in itself makes people slow down and pay attention a little bit better. So the plan elements. And I've talked a lot about the need to balance transportation modes, but what we find is that most of the time in these planning processes, we have a very limited amount of right-of-way. Foster was a little bit different. The western part of Foster actually has a lot of right-of-way. It's very wide, it has wide sidewalks, and we had more options there. The eastern part of Foster, which is on 82nd and East, is a lot narrower with only 5 or 6 foot sidewalks, and there were a lot fewer options for us in that area. But what I'd like to do is talk about some of the basic elements and then some of the trade-offs that we had to look at and ultimately come to agreement on. In terms of creating a safe walking environment, the plan recommends a number of curb extensions and refuge islands that help people get across the street. The curb extensions, as probably most of you know, help shorten the pedestrian crossing distance. They make the pedestrians more visible because they're out on the edges instead of back behind the parked cars. And in quite a few cases in this plan, we tried to coordinate them with the transit stops. So the transit riders have a bigger place to wait, they're more visible, and then the bus can come right up to the curb. And on this street, that's really not a problem because there are 2 travel lanes for vehicles in each direction, and the traffic analysis didn't show a lot of slowing of traffic to get around the buses when they stopped in the lane of travel. But TriMet does recognize that's an issue, and so we tried to work with them and alternate the curb extension stops with stops where the bus comes all the way into the curb and gets out of the travel lane. So those are some of the trade-offs that you make. It's better for the bus to stop in the lane of traffic. It doesn't have to get back out again. But the vehicles need to keep moving, so at some points the bus will move over. Then the other trade-off there is that both of those options actually reduce the amount of on-street parking that's available, and so you have to look at every site specifically and look at how much parking is there and whether there's off-site parking available, and determine whether that's a good place to actually put in a bus zone and reduce the number of on-street parking spots, or whether we might want to look at another location for the bus stop. The other thing that we found in this project was there's a school crossing at 78th, and a lot of drivers were actually disregarding the red light when it did change for the pedestrians to cross and the school kids. And that's obviously not a good thing. It's hard enough to get a signal in for a school crossing, but then when the drivers don't obey it and the pedestrians are assuming they will, you can imagine that there are a lot of safety concerns. So we looked at doing some technical things just to make the signal more visible, make it bigger, give it a backboard so you don't have sun glare and that type of thing. But we also recommended a curb extension that reduces the crossing distance and again makes the pedestrians, the kids, more visible there as they're waiting to cross the street. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see you back there. Yeah.
Hold the button down kind of hard, but one of the viewers is having trouble hearing the question. Okay. I noticed that on some of these pedestrian crossings, you have a marked parallel crosswalk, and some of them have big fat horizontal stripes for the crosswalk. Why are they different? How did you decide which one to use?
There's actually standards that the traffic engineers apply, and there's certain times when one is appropriate and certain times than the other. It's prescribed. So our traffic engineer just tells us which one to put in according to the site conditions and what kind of a crossing it is. So, and I can't remember the exact terminology of why one's one and one's the other, but it is all prescribed. There are engineering standards they use and that the city's adopted.
Far less interesting than I hoped.
Yeah, sorry, there's no good, fun answer to that one.
I did have
Yeah.
a related question. I noticed some of the crossings are parallel to the cross streets, and some of them are perpendicular to Foster. And it seems to me that the perpendicular crossings are better because they're shorter. Was there a reason that some of them remain parallel with the cross streets?
Parallel to the,
So running purely north-south as opposed to perpendicular to Foster?
usually it has to do, because it's an angled street and they're offset, they're looking at where it's going to hit the curb on the other side, which may not be necessarily straight perpendicular, because it may come in mid-block instead of at the corner. And there are a lot of other things that the engineers will look at. But that's the primary one, is looking at, I mean, we try to shorten the pedestrian crossing distance, but if it's going to end up mid-block and be confusing to the drivers where the stop line is, we want to make sure that the drivers are going to stop. So sometimes that's a judgment call, and sometimes it's pretty clear-cut. Does that answer your question?
I think it was fairly recently that a small child was killed on Foster trying to cross it, and I was wondering if you guys looked into that and to see if there was any way to help a situation like that.
Not specifically those. Usually are investigated by a different department. Our operations people will go out after there's an incident like that and determine if there are any immediate issues that can be addressed through the physical, changes or operational changes if it's at a signal. I'm not familiar with exactly where that one was. Do you know?
It was closer to Powell.
Closer to Powell. Sometimes there's really not a lot they can do depending on the circumstances. It may be driver error. It might be the pedestrian wasn't exercising caution. I mean, there's a lot of other variables. But they first look at the police reports and try to determine the cause of the accident. And I know, or crash, they don't really say accident in this terminology. But you've seen areas like out on St. Helens Road when the boy was killed about a year and a half ago, and ODOT went right out and put in some different physical features to help that. But they don't go out necessarily and look at every single fatality, but they do look at what the police bureau has found through their investigation and if they recommend any physical improvements.
Do you guys look at the accidents?
Yes, we look at all the crash statistics. That's part of the data collection process that will collect all of that information and analyze it. How many were car to car to bike, bike pedestrian, car pedestrian, where they occurred, and if there's extenuating circumstances in terms of, if they were in a crosswalk, if a driver disregarded a signal, that type of thing. So we can ascertain whether there's something that we can do, say, if it's a signalized intersection, to make it more visible or safer, somehow work better to avoid those kinds of issues. So back to Foster. One of the curious things when you have an angled street is you get these really funny intersections, and this may relate, Rob, a little bit to your question, is that in a lot of cases there's a lot of real estate out there on the street because the angles make these very wide places. And so what we tried to do here was not just across Foster, but as you're walking along Foster, as you see in this example, there would have been quite a bit of crossing distance from Ellis, see where the first yellow dot is, down over to the other one. And the curb extensions are recommended so we shorten that crossing distance and get the pedestrians to walk as much parallel to Foster when they're walking along the street as possible. So We weren't just looking at the crossing of Foster itself, but what the walking environment's like along Foster. So we can, basically the goal is to keep pedestrians out of harm's way as much as possible by shortening the distance, the crossings, looking for places where we can narrow down driveways and other curb cuts. Yeah.
My question relates basically to auto travel along
Mm-hmm.
that street. It seems like streets like Foster and like Sandy that are these, kind of these diagonal streets that have all these really odd intersections
Mm-hmm.
always seem kind of helter-skelter as far as motorist behavior. And then when you throw into the mix lots of parking lot access points, it seems like it just gets really crazy. When you looked at Foster, did you find it advisable to look at some of those access points and say maybe we need to restrict some of those, or because there's so many access points already on that street?
Yeah, we did. We had an intern that went out and recorded all the driveways and curb cuts, and whether they were going to a parking lot or to a loading area. And in some cases where they were extra wide or there were multiple access points to a business, we looked at the possibility that those could be narrowed or somehow consolidated. But then what we do is go out and talk to those property or business owners and talk to them about how their customers or their delivery people use that access and see if it's going to cause problems or if we can negotiate something. So we're not going to just go and say, sorry, we're taking out one of your driveways. But we will work with them and see if there's a way to reduce the number of them or their width, if that's a possibility. Yeah.
Could you learn anything from looking at Sandy, or I don't know if there was a Streetscape plan, there was like a Hollywood Sandy Town Center plan, but just from past efforts on this type of diagonal street, is there anything to draw on from Sandy?
There was a little bit, but the Hollywood Sandy plan was a lot bigger in scope. It wasn't looking just at transportation. It was looking at a lot of land use and future development options. So they didn't get to this level of detail in their recommendations. Some of the ideas and the designs for the intersections with the angled street are similar, and we did look at those to see where we could incorporate similar kinds of ways to reduce the amount of street and shorten the crossing distance. Sandy's right now in the process of going back and doing the transportation and streetscape plan, so they're now going to the level of detail and beyond what this plan did. So unfortunately, they didn't have enough detail in some cases, but where there was information, we did look at it, because that's really the only other applicable model. See, I think I've talked quite a bit about the bus service already, but this is just an example of what one of the transit curb extension intersections would look like, where you have the long curb extensions on the two sides where the bus stops, and then you have a shorter one on the other two. And the reason for that, especially if you have a far side bus stop, is that you need to do a curb extension on the near side so a driver doesn't drive right into the back of the bus. It's basically protecting the bus on the other side a little bit. I mean, they still are in the lane of travel, but you try to minimize the confusion at the intersection by equalizing the lanes and the amount the sidewalk comes out into the intersection. Now, bicycle access was a real curious issue on Foster for a number of reasons. The city has an established, adopted bike plan that designates all of the approved bikeways, bike boulevards, and so forth for the city. And one of the things we do when we start any project is look at where those are and whether any of those are on or near our project area. Now, in this case, Foster Road actually was not designated for any kind of bike access, for a bike boulevard, for bike lanes, and so forth. But it's a pretty convenient way to go because it cuts across the grid. And what this map shows is the existing bike routes, the approved bike routes in red, and I'll get to the bikeway opportunity in a minute. And so a lot of the bicycle advocates wanted us to take a step back and look at the option of bike lanes on Foster, and we did that because a lot of people wanted to. Now, it's easy to say, sorry, it's not designated, that's it, move on, but we really wanted to see if it could work, and we did some analysis, and part of the street, the western part of the street, actually is wide enough. You can get the travel lanes. There's actually more sidewalk than you need, and it was possible to get a bike lane from 50th to maybe not all the way up to 72nd, but pretty darn close. But the other thing that always gets in the way is money. And so then our engineers went and looked at how much it would cost. Because in this case, you're not just bringing a sidewalk out, which is usually what we're trying to do is widen sidewalks, but you're pulling it back. And the issues were not just removing the curb and sidewalk and moving it back and rebuilding that part of the pavement, but also all the drainage under the street, all of the outlets, everything else that is right at the curb line also had to be torn up and moved back. And we ended up with a price tag for about less than 20 blocks of $3 million for that bike lane when it was all said and done. And our citizen advisory committee and our stakeholders looked at that and said, you know, that's about what we're aiming for the whole project in terms of our budget. And it would be great if somebody else could come along and find money and do this, but we really think that there are a lot of other needs on Foster, and at this point we're not sure that that's the best way to recommend spending the money.
Was there not enough room by narrowing the auto lanes, or was that not an option?
No, there wasn't enough room. One of the mandates that we were given when we started this project is that we needed to maintain the 2 travel lanes in each direction. And we also have guidelines in the city for sidewalk width based on in the pedestrian master plan and pedestrian design guides. And that told us in that area that we had to maintain a 12-foot sidewalk. There was actually 17 feet of sidewalk, so we had plenty of right-of-way to work with, but we had to move the curbs back, and that's where the cost factor came in.
I actually worked in a class that also studied this for a class project, and my proposal was to use that 5 extra feet, you're saying or 17 feet, and not move the drainage and all that, but just repave the sidewalk with, say, pavers to delineate that that's a parking space. Move the parking over, but maintain the slope of the sidewalk. So basically you have, instead of on your car parked on the right-hand side of the road, having the gutter be in the right wheel, the gutter would be under the car somewhere. Did that design concept get talked about at all?
Well, we looked.
That it would be kind of a V thing where the existing slopes would all enter, and I think it makes sense if you had to move the drainage to over 5 feet, but if you just repaved it and called it parking area, you wouldn't have to move the drainage.
Well,
Is that design concept talked about at all?
we looked at ways that we could accomplish this without moving the drainage. And there are 2 issues. I mean, there are a lot of city standards that have to be adhered to, and both the engineering side, and then we also, in that case, have to work with the Bureau of Environmental Services and other city agencies. And we explored any way that we could get this price tag down by not doing big things like moving the drainage, but the ultimate answer was there's really no way to do it with current standards. Now, you're right, there are a lot of technical solutions that could be applied, but in the standards that exist today that would be readily approved, no. Yeah.
I was looking at some other projects where they, I mean, I realize Foster is a busy street, but were there problems, first of all, with left-hand turns on Foster? I don't remember seeing a left-hand turn lane at all on Foster. And I've seen on other streets where that was a problem, but they did eliminate the lane in each direction, put in a center lane for left-hand turns, and then put in bicycle lanes in place, so that, you know, since you're saving a lane there. And I'm just curious whether that was exempt.
Well, we looked at the volumes, and we looked at, well, like I said from the beginning, we were really given the mandate of not reducing the number of vehicle travel lanes. But we did look at if it would be possible with the volumes, and it's really not, especially when you're not in an area like Hawthorne where people are traveling slowly, that you're looking at moving vehicles out in a part of town that people aren't going to be going as slowly in. But basically it was the volumes that we can't reduce the travel lane. There are left-hand turn lanes in some parts, and the turning movements and the crash data didn't show that any of the turning movements were particularly a problem, except in one place, and it's actually an illegal turn where people westbound, as they get pretty close to Powell, want to get to the post office. And there's a little post office there, and there's a little tiny little curb in the middle that prevents people. But if you have a tall enough car, people just drive right over it and into the parking lot. And one of the challenges there was trying to find a safe access for those westbound drivers to get into the post office. But other than that, the turning movements weren't really too much of a problem on the street.
I'm sorry, I didn't get, who became the mandate?
Pardon?
Who were the people who became the mandate?
Which there are, well, the city has codes that they've adopted. Some are national standards, some are local standards, but they're all administered by the city engineer, who has ultimate responsibility in determining whether something meets that requirement or whether there's any latitude in making that adaptation. But that's just for the transportation part. Then when you go to the stormwater, and I'm not as familiar with it, but the Bureau of Environmental Services is responsible for all the stormwater, and they have both state Department of Environmental Quality regulations as well as federal water quality regulations, and not just the quality of water, but they also mandate the type of drainage and the type of outlets and sumps and all the stuff that's under the street in some cases. So it comes from a variety of sources.
So is the current width of the lanes mandated that they couldn't be shrunken any? The current width of the 4 lanes couldn't be narrowed?
They could be narrowed a little bit, but not enough to get your bike lane on either side, because you need a minimum of 5 or 6 feet. And that if you've got a 12-foot travel lane and you go to an 11-foot travel lane, that only buys you a foot on each side, or if you're only looking at the outside lane. And where there's no center lane, they typically don't like to go as narrow, because you don't have that, what they call a shy distance, where the two vehicles are passing one another, and the possibility for oncoming collisions is greater when you start narrowing the lane in the center. Oh, sorry.
These questions come from one of our viewers.
Okay.
Wetland. And Brian wants to know what Thompson Road's classification is, functional classification, and what some of the speeds were that were measured in the traffic study.
Okay. The speeds, actually, if somebody has the technical appendix around, but basically I don't recall all of the classifications, but they are in there. Someone could grab that for me, and I will answer that. The question about the speeds, though, the posted speed is 35, and in the western area we were finding averages about 38, and in the eastern area a tad bit higher. Now that's an average. They were spiking. If you took the absolute highest, they would find up to 50. But basically they found, for the most part, the average speed was within 3 miles an hour of the posted speed. I do know that, like I said, it's not classified as any type of a bike street. It is some type of an emergency access route. It's either a major pedestrian street or a pedestrian walkway, major transit route, and probably, I can't remember the vehicle classification off the top of my head. Anybody else out in Webland?
He had one more question. His follow-up question was, how does TriMet feel about the stopping buses in traffic given the speeds, but maybe the speeds aren't as much of a problem as you thought?
I don't really want to answer for them, but I do know that TriMet generally likes to have the bus stop in the travel lane because it can start right up again. It doesn't have to wait for the vehicles to, a clear place to get back into the traffic lane. So we didn't really have an issue with the speeds that I remember in working with TriMet, but they do recognize the need to kind of alternate those so they're not always stopping in the lane of travel. Not in Webland.
Oh, I have the answer for him.
Okay.
From your document.
Oh, great. Thanks.
It says City of Portland classification of the motor vehicle is a major city traffic street.
Okay.
For freight, it's a minor truck street. Transit is a major transit priority street. And I think you got the rights. It's a regional corridor
Okay.
for street design classifications.
Lynn, you're
Yes.
going to repeat the question and repeat what Maureen just said, because these mics aren't working.
Okay. Okay, why don't you just...
Sorry about that.
That's okay. Thanks.
Even though the lights work,
All right. The question was, what are the classifications for Foster Road? And basically for bikes, it has no classification. For pedestrians, it's a city walkway. For transit, it's a major transit priority street. For freight, it's a minor truck street. Motor vehicles, major city traffic street. And then there are some design classifications as well as a regional corridor and a regional main street. Any other questions? So just to complete the bike discussion here, what we did find, while it's not the ultimate solution on the diagonal street, is that on the eastern part of the corridor, which I haven't talked a whole lot about, but that's where the corridor narrows and we actually have a lot less right-of-way. We found from 72nd, which is a bike route, and the Parkway, that we could use Raymond and Levy streets, which are relatively quiet, access a school, and come back in right at 90th into Foster and access Lentz Town Center with a few modifications and additions on that street. But it's in very good condition. It would provide a nice residential street bikeway and a through street. And so with very low cost for a couple of new stop signs and very minor modifications that could be addressed. So our recommendation was to make that route a new bikeway, and then that's working itself through the transportation, the updates to the transportation master plans for all the different modes. So the recommendation from this plan was that that be adopted, and it's just now working through that process. And then I mentioned earlier making the street just more comfortable and attractive. These are a lot of the things that are addressed in the design toolbox that are going around, but in this case we were looking at adding a lot of street trees, making Foster a much greener environment, adding pedestrian scale or what you would call ornamental street lighting in the districts, and other amenities that would help both visually narrow the street, give pedestrians shade, give them a little bit more sense of enclosure, a buffer when there aren't parked cars, and other things that really make it more interesting. Now, one of the things I'm not sure I made really clear up front is that our mandate and our planning area is only the right-of-way, so we can't really affect what happens on the private property next to the street, but as much as possible to encourage any redevelopment to open up their windows if they're boarded up, to redevelop in a way that provides what we would call building permeability, that you can see in, you can walk in, you can get to that building and to build up to the back of the sidewalk in these areas. The other piece that didn't get a lot of attention but did get some, especially toward the end of the process, was really looking at the opportunity for public art. Both the idea of incorporating it into some of the infrastructure items like the bus stops, and this is an example of one of the transit shelters on Alberta Street. The opportunity for murals such as this one on one of the buildings, which again is private property, and there are other issues with murals, but where the property owner is willing and they meet the requirements of the city code to use those outdoor areas, as well as with some of those triangular spaces. Once we added more sidewalk and took that away from the street, there would be some opportunity for public art in those areas, because we'd be creating, in a sense, these little triangular islands in some places. We didn't go much further than that, feeling that there would need to be a community process to identify the locations and the type of art and the type of artists that they would want to have involved in the process. So that's basically it for the plan, and then people always want to say, well, what happens next? And the next piece, the plan did include cost estimates of what building the improvements would cost, and we costed these out by intersection as well as by district and corridor, so that if funding were available in pieces and not all together, we would be able to go forward with some parts of the plan. And we did identify what would be our priority phasing strategy. But already what we found is that in the eastern part of the corridor, which is east of 79th, is actually in the Lentz Urban Renewal Area. And because of that, they have funding available for improvements in that district. And they also had identified some of the areas on Foster Road as places they wanted to improve. So my understanding is that they're going forward with designing some of the intersection improvements at 80th, 82nd, and 84th that will be funded through the urban renewal process. And I'm not sure where that funding is. I don't know the exact status, but I do know they were talking about going forward with some engineering and design. So that's one way that once the plan's in place, if there's some money available, at least some pieces can get done now and others can get designed and built later as we identify the funds and are able to move forward. So that's pretty much the plan, the process. I know that's a lot to cover in less than an hour, and there are a lot of probably other questions, so feel free. Okay.
What do you consider to be good public, well, good turnout at a citizen participation event? And how did you go about engaging the community and coming up with a concept map? And I'm asking that more on a physical, like actually the tools, because my workshop group is going to be doing something similar to that, and I'm curious what works.
Okay.
What you found for.
Good turnout at a public meeting really varies on the project and the neighborhood you're working in, and also kind of how engaged they are. If you have 50 people who are very engaged and really represent a diverse number of interests, geographic areas within your project area, and hopefully different income levels, different ethnicities, and so forth, it's not so much the number really as the representation. We've had very productive meetings with 30 people, and we've had great meetings with 200, but 200 does get a bit unwieldy so from time to time. In terms of tools, with this project and others, we find that the more hands-on people can get, the better, and also the more you can structure the questions with good information. I know that sounds really vague, but rather than asking them to consider the universe, and it depends on where you are in the process, if you're looking at concepts or if you're looking at design details, we found that the best way to approach it is really to give them a good overview of information so they understand what they're being asked to consider. And then without trying to prescribe the only options available, to try to figure out a small range of options and a preliminary list of pros and cons or benefits and drawbacks so that you can generate some discussion with those. And then they're free to add others and free to add their own options as well. But the thing is that if you give people a blank slate, especially if they're not trained in design or in transportation, they're not sure where to start. So what we try to do is give them enough to start with and enough good information, but leave it open enough for them to have a good dialogue and be able to suggest new things that we may not have put on the table. So I don't know if that helps.
Do you actually have them work on maps or look at specific intersections? Do you give them sort of parameters of, using green street treatments, or, do you give them problem solve specific spots?
It depends on the level of the planning. Here, we weren't really getting to that level of detail in some cases of, solving the intersection design, for example. But what we did when we went to the second workshop is we gave them the whole toolbox overview. We gave the presentation in about 20 minutes and showed what some of the tools are to make crossings better, to accomplish certain goals. And then we asked them in their groups to talk about those and come up with, which they would prefer in these locations. Given the character of the street and the nature of the problem, would you rather have curb extensions? Would you rather have median refuge islands? And people had a pretty definite point of view about which they wanted and which they didn't like for various reasons.
And then their concerns, do they directly feed into the plan that you ended up with?
Yeah, they did. And what we do as well is we have our traffic engineer come to every meeting. Because people often have a lot of very specific technical issues, and we're not always up to speed, like why did those crosswalks have to be painted with these kind of lines instead of those kind of lines? So we always have them there to answer those technical questions. If people are saying, why can't you do this at an intersection the traffic engineer may say, oh, great, we didn't really think about that, but if you're interested in it, we can look at it. Or they may say, well, it's not going to work because of X, Y, Z, and then we use that opportunity to also give them more information. Okay. Yeah.
Given that, one of the major focuses of this plan seems to have been to increase the pedestrian environment, make the pedestrian environment safer. This may seem kind of left field, but one of the things that always seems to me that when the police leave, they'll put on a trailer, they put the little speed indicator sign on a trailer, and they'll just leave it in a certain spot. That seems to be one of the most effective ways to make people slow down. It seems people get right down to that, exact speed limit. And I was just wondering, has it ever been considered to kind of tastefully do a permanent speed indicator?
Not that I know of. Okay, the question, oh, I'm sorry.
They do?
I was in Prague a few weeks ago, and they had.
The question was that those little signs, those speed indicators by the side of the road are very effective in getting people to slow down, but they're always temporary. Has there been any thought of designing them tastefully and incorporating them permanently? And not that I know of, and I don't know why. I really don't, but I will ask. Off the top of my head, I could imagine beyond the money issue and that everybody would want one to slow down the traffic, that it would be like anything else, is that once you drive by it a few times, it's kind of the surprise element of if that thing's out there or it's moved to another location that gets you to really notice it. And after a while, you just, oh yeah, it's that thing. And you almost just tune it out and you don't know how fast you're going anymore. Yes?
Does this thing work?
Speak loudly and maybe your microphone.
Okay. What I was going to be curious about, you were mentioning that there were places where the sidewalk was very narrow and it had the utility poles in it, fences. I imagine that those would be spread across the area and not all necessarily in the areas you were focusing on. Are all of those areas which are pedestrian unfriendly going to be covered, or are there areas where there's segments that are pedestrian unfriendly that simply aren't in the areas that are going to be addressed?
If I understand your question, the areas with the narrow sidewalks are entirely in the eastern section, east of 82nd. So they're not spread out all over. The sidewalk width is relatively consistent and wide on the west side of 82nd. So the only substandard sidewalks are east of 82nd, and it's consistent out there. Now, because of the classification of that area, when those properties redevelop, they would be required to provide an additional, I believe, 3 feet of sidewalk to dedicate that. We leave those typically to the discretion of the city engineer, because there may be some case where there's a hardship or some reason, say if there's a historic building or something that you may not want to do that setback. But basically, because the vehicle lanes are very narrow in that area, we couldn't widen the sidewalk by taking them out of the vehicle travel lane without eliminating the on-street parking. And it's only on one side out there, so we're looking at a much more constricted right-of-way. So basically in that area, which is also much less densely commercial and much less used by pedestrians, that'll be a more evolutionary process as those properties redevelop. In terms of the blank walls and the fences, those are all private property issues, and unfortunately our planning process only encompasses the public right-of-way. So while we encourage people to either make them interesting or choose something else, we can't necessarily legislate that.
There's 3 more web questions.
Okay, 3 web questions.
I'll try to do this succinctly. Did you send out information in Spanish? What other things did TriMet propose besides the curb extensions for streamlining? And then the third one is, even if you had bike lanes on Foster, would you expect high bike volume?
Okay, the first question is easy. We did not mail any information in Spanish. We did have Spanish translators available at the community workshops. Based on our work with Southeast Uplift, who was coordinating the Foster Target Area program, while they identified some Spanish-speaking people in the community, most of them also were fairly fluent in English, whereas the Russian community were much more recent immigrants and tended to have much fewer family members, especially of parent age or older. The young children would speak English, but beyond teenagers often didn't. So they were the ones that identified Russian as the language that we should translate into for our mailing materials. Second question, did TriMet consider other things? Yes. We also, and I didn't mention these, looked at moving some stops or consolidating stops in some places, which the plan does incorporate, and also moving stops to the far side of intersections instead of the near side so that they would move through the intersection and then stop to pick up and unload passengers. And in addition, there are some places identified to get transit shelters, and I believe all the new signage and schedules are up in that area as well now. And then the third question was,
Even if you had bike lanes, would you expect high bike volume?
it's hard to say. I think the bicycle community would say yes, but I think overall, the further you get from the core, the fewer cyclists overall you see. I mean, you're not going to see the volume you see over the Hawthorne Bridge because a lot of the cyclists tend to be, within a few miles. But I think you would see some use. There's always a question within the bicycle transportation kind of advocacy if the people that choose to go the most direct route and be on a bike lane that's on an arterial that's relatively busy, and then the riders who are less comfortable with that and would choose a less direct but safer route on a bike boulevard, which is more of a residential street that's been designated as a through street, may have some traffic circles or other things to slow traffic. So, it's hard to say. It really is. But generally, Southeast Portland, when you're that far out, doesn't have quite the volume of ridership as the core areas. Yes?
I was curious what fate, if any, did the projects that the graduate students that they did in Jeff Mitchum's class last winter meet in terms of, because we did different kind of design analysis, just ideas for sections of Foster Road, and if those were reviewed by your team and what any ideas transferred over.
It would have been nice to have it more incorporated, but we weren't actually even made aware of the project in any significant way or the results. So we would have been happy to look at them or maybe have a meeting with the advisory committee and the students, because I know that's often a really good way to learn, is to have like a meeting at the beginning where you hear from the community or the team what the project goals are, go off and work, and at the end present back and get some feedback. But the class wasn't structured that way, so we weren't really able to incorporate any of those options. Yes?
Was there any thought about because of the diagonal you have with this triangle that was that you were showing, and then the curve extensions kind of enlarge those triangles? Was there any thought of providing space for street vendors or very small businesses?
There wasn't any thought particularly as to that kind of a use. It certainly is, is possible. What we did try to do is leave some of those decisions back with the community and with the business groups there to say, okay, if there are some spaces here, would you like to see public art? Do you want more bike racks? What uses? So we didn't try to program the spaces, in other words, but to leave them open. So the short answer is no, but it certainly would be possible for a community or business group to take it upon themselves once they're there to see what else could be incorporated, either for short-term use or, more permanent installation. Great. Well, thank you.
And next week we have Brian